The legend goes that Clessie Cummins borrowed $500, built the engine that would eventually power more than half of all heavy-duty American trucks, and died without ever being the majority owner of the company that carries his name. This is the story of how that happened and why the answer is more complicated than a simple tale of an inventor getting robbed. When W.G. Irwin first walked into the garage where Clessie Cummins worked, what he found was not a man doing routine maintenance on a car. He found a man who had taken apart something that wasn't broken because he believed he could make it work better. Clessie was already deep inside the problem of internal combustion, the kind of deep that doesn't come from a classroom and doesn't stop at closing time. Irwin had hired him as his personal driver in 1908, and what he was looking at by the end of that first year was something considerably harder to replace than a driver. William Glanton Irwin was the kind of man who could quietly reshape an entire region without ever raising his voice. President of Irwin Union Bank in Columbus, with money spread across railroads, food packing, and real estate, Irwin was a banker, an industrialist, and a philanthropist who hired Clessie Cummins in 1908 to drive his cars and keep them running. What Irwin got from that arrangement, however, was something much more valuable than just a driver. Clessie Cummins was not simply a mechanic. He was an obsessive problem solver who treated every broken or inefficient machine as a personal challenge, reading technical manuals the way other men read novels, and diagnosing an engine by listening to it. And sometime in the years before the First World War, he became fascinated by an idea that most American engineers considered either impractical or outright ridiculous: the diesel engine. By 1919, the diesel engine had already been evaluated and rejected by American industry. It wasn't that the engineers hadn't heard of it, they had looked at it carefully and simply walked away. The engines were way too heavy, too slow to respond, and too dependent on fuel injection systems that nobody had yet made reliable enough for a vehicle that needed to accelerate, sit in traffic, and cold start on a February morning in Indiana. That was the field Clessie Cummins entered, not a neglected opportunity, but a problem the industry had already concluded was unsolvable. Picture what a diesel engine actually looked like in that era. We're talking about a machine the size of a small room, bolted to the floor of a factory or the hull of a ship, running at a fixed speed with an entire crew of men standing by to service it. It didn't throttle up and down, and it didn't start quickly. It was simply built for one job, running continuously at one load. And it did that job well enough that nobody had bothered to make it do anything else. Asking that machine to power a truck down a highway was like asking a blast furnace to heat a kitchen. That was the wall Clessie Cummins decided to walk through. In 1919, he convinced W.G. Irwin to back him in a new venture, and Cummins Engine Company was incorporated on February 3rd of that year. Clessie brought the mechanical genius, Irwin brought the money. The structure of what would follow, who owned what and how much, was baked into the company from that very first day. The first engine Cummins produced was based on a licensed design called the Hvid, a single-cylinder diesel intended for stationary industrial use. It was not Clessie's own design, but it was a starting point and a way to generate some revenue while he worked towards something better. In 1922, Sears Roebuck agreed to sell these engines through their catalog, and it seemed like the breakthrough the company needed. But it immediately fell apart. The Hvid engines were plagued with defects. Sears canceled the contract, and the company had spent years building inventory it couldn't move. W.G. Irwin had already poured what the records describe as several $100,000 into the venture, and the return was zero. For most investors, that's the moment you cut your losses. But Irwin? He kept writing checks. Here's the thing about patient capital, and this is a concept that matters enormously to what happens to Clessie Cummins later. Patient capital is money that doesn't need to come back next quarter, or next year, or even next decade. It's money backed by deep reserves and genuine conviction, and W.G. Irwin had both. But that patience came with a structural consequence, because the longer Irwin funded the company without a return, the more of it he owned. Clessie's equity was real, but it was dwarfed by what the Irwin money represented. Clessie responded to the Hvid disaster the only way he knew how, by designing something better himself. In 1921, he patented a direct injection fuel system that was genuinely new. Instead of the indirect, fumbling injection methods that made early diesels so unpredictable at varying speeds, Clessie's system delivered fuel directly into the combustion chamber with precision and control. One expert later described it as simpler than a fountain pen, and that simplicity was the breakthrough because it meant the engine could run cleaner, respond faster, and be tuned for vehicles that needed to accelerate, slow down, and change load constantly. The exact opposite of a factory generator sitting at fixed speed all day. By 1924, Cummins Engine Company had its first genuinely homegrown engine line, the Model F, built on Clessie's design and his injection patent, which gave the company its first real product identity. But selling industrial diesel engines to a market that didn't believe in them was still an uphill fight. The American trucking industry ran on gasoline, railroad operators ran steam, and diesel was foreign, unfamiliar, and expensive to maintain without a mechanic who understood it. Clessie needed to change the perception of the engine itself, and he understood that engineering papers and trade show demonstrations weren't going to do it. What he needed was a spectacle. By late 1929, W.G. Irwin had been funding Cummins Engine Company for 10 years without a single profitable year to show for it. The stock market had just collapsed in October, and Irwin's personal finances, spread across banking, railroads, and real estate, were under the same pressure, squeezing every major investor in America. He was, by multiple accounts, seriously considering shutting the company down. What Clessie understood about that moment was that no engineering argument was going to save him. Irwin had heard the engineering arguments for a decade. What Clessie needed to give him was something that landed in the gut, not the head. On Christmas Day, 1929, Clessie drove W.G. Irwin through the streets of Columbus, Indiana, in a Packard limousine fitted with a Cummins marine diesel engine. It ran smoothly, quietly, and without incident. Irwin sat in the back of a diesel-powered car on the worst possible day to be asking a man to keep funding a losing venture, and he felt it work. That ride was not a demonstration of what the engine could do in general. It was a demonstration designed for an audience of one. A man whose signature on a check was the only thing standing between Cummins Engine Company and a locked door. And that's when Clessie did something that tells you everything about how his mind worked. He decided to make it impossible to ignore the engine. In February of 1931, Clessie drove a Duesenberg chassis fitted with a Cummins 4-cylinder diesel engine onto the sands of Daytona Beach, Florida, and ran it at 100.755 miles per hour. A diesel engine, the slow, heavy factory machine nobody believed could power a road vehicle, had just set a new diesel speed record. The press covered it and the public noticed. But Clessie? He was just getting started. 3 months later, in May of 1931, a Cummins-powered Duesenberg racing car, numbered 8, rolled into the Indianapolis 500, driven by Dave Evans, and finished 13th without making a single pit stop. The gasoline-powered cars in that race were stopping regularly to refuel, but the diesel ran the entire 500 miles on one tank, and the fuel it consumed cost exactly $1.40. That was not an engineering statistic, that was a headline. And it was a story every truck fleet owner in America could understand immediately. Clessie Cummins later called this era his Barnum and Bailey days, which is a pretty accurate description because he knew exactly what he was doing. He was running a circus of engineering proof, and the Indianapolis 500 was the biggest tent in America. If it worked at Indy, it would work anywhere. But the demonstrations didn't stop at one race. In December of 1931, Clessie and his crew drove a Cummins-powered truck in a non-stop endurance run at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway for 2 full weeks, covering 13,535 miles continuously, day and night. At one point, Clessie's brother Don even climbed onto the moving truck to repair a broken steering arm without stopping, because stopping would have ended the record. The coverage was national, the stunt was extraordinary. 4 years later, in 1935, Clessie drove a Cummins-powered Auburn passenger car from New York City to San Francisco, and the entire transcontinental trip consumed $7.63 worth of fuel. At a time when most American drivers thought of diesel as a mystery substance reserved for ships and European locomotives, Clessie Cummins had just crossed the country on the cost of a decent meal. The demonstrations were working, the reputation of the diesel engine was improving, and truck operators, they were actually starting to pay attention. But somehow, Cummins Engine Company still hadn't turned a profit. 18 years of operations, 18 years of W.G. Irwin's money, and the first profitable year didn't arrive until 1937. Most businesses fail in 5 years, and most investors walk after 2. Irwin was definitely built different, but that investor patience came at a price Clessie Cummins would eventually feel deep in his bones. In 1934, a young man named J. Irwin Miller joined Cummins Engine Company, reportedly in his mid-20s at the time. A Yale and Oxford graduate, Miller was W.G. Irwin's great-nephew, and his arrival at the company was not a coincidence. His rapid rise within Cummins had by most accounts everything to do with that family connection, but what he brought to the company was also genuinely substantial. J. Irwin Miller was not an engineer. He was a businessman with a particular kind of vision focused on markets, people, and organizational structure rather than combustion chambers and fuel injectors. Cummins Engine Company had the great product, and what it needed, Miller believed, was the commercial discipline. He also held a perspective on workers and labor relations that was unusual for the era, supporting unionization at Cummins at a time when most manufacturers were fighting it hard. The dynamic at Cummins in this period is captured pretty well by one particular anecdote. In 1943, J. Irwin Miller married Zenia Simmons, whom he had met while she was working in the Cummins purchasing department and sitting across from him on opposite sides of union negotiations. The best man at their wedding was Clessie Cummins, the inventor and the heir standing together at an altar. 2 men who needed each other, and both of them knew it. Andy Redwine, co-producer of a documentary about Clessie Cummins, put it plainly, saying that Clessie was more interested in innovation, and W.G. Irwin and J. Irwin Miller were interested in monetizing that innovation, and that all of them needed one another. But needing each other and owning equal shares of the result are very different things.
W.G. Irwin died on December 14, 1943, having spent 24 years and an enormous personal fortune keeping Cummins Engine Company alive through 2 world wars, a catastrophic depression, a cancelled Sears contract, and 18 consecutive years without a profit. He never saw the company become what it would become, but the Irwin family's stake in Cummins, accumulated through all those years of investment, was enormous. 3 years after Irwin's death, in 1946, Cummins Engine Company went public. The IPO was the moment when decades of private investment became publicly tradable stock, and it was the moment when the full picture of who owned what became visible. Clessie Cummins held 84,600 shares of common stock, which was a real position and a meaningful one. But it was not one of controlling ownership of the company bearing his name. In 1947, Clessie sold 50,000 of those shares for approximately $1 million. By the standards of the time, it was enough to secure his family's financial future. He kept the remaining shares and continued working for Cummins as a salaried employee. J. Irwin Miller became president of Cummins in 1947, the same year Clessie sold his shares, and then chairman of the board in 1951, a position he would hold until 1977. The transition was complete. The Irwin family had gone from patient investor to de facto owner to active chairman, and Clessie Cummins, the man whose mechanical genius had made all of it possible, was a shareholder and an employee in a company he could no longer control. But then, in 1952, Clessie got one more moment in the sun. The Cummins Diesel Special, car number 28, turbocharged and driven by Freddie Agabashian, rolled into qualifying at the Indianapolis 500 in May of 1952 and recorded a one-lap speed of 139.104 miles per hour. It captured the pole position, a diesel car on the pole at Indianapolis, and it was apparently the first Indy car ever put through a wind tunnel, with aerodynamics that nobody at the speedway had bothered to test before. It was the fastest diesel racing car the world had ever seen. But the race itself didn't go as planned. The turbocharger inlet clogged with rubber debris from the track surface, the car retired after just 71 laps, and the Cummins Diesel Special finished 27th, earning $2,653 in prize money. But by the time that turbocharger clogged, the damage was already done, in the best possible way. Every truck fleet operator in America had seen the qualifying results. A diesel had been the fastest car at Indianapolis, and nobody was going to unsee that headline. The commercial consequences were real and immediate. From 1952 to 1959, Cummins N-Series engines powered more than half of the heavy-duty truck market in the United States. 1 in 2 heavy trucks running American highways in that era had a Cummins engine under the hood. An engine whose fundamental design traced directly back to the work Clessie Cummins had done in a garage in Columbus, Indiana, with borrowed money and a borrowed idea from a dead German engineer named Rudolf Diesel. The company that had never turned a profit until 1937 was now the industry leader, and the diesel engine that nobody believed in had become the dominant technology in American commercial transportation. Every one of those trucks had his name on the engine. Yet Clessie Cummins was drawing a salary. Here's the thing about how Clessie Cummins ended up in that position, because it doesn't fit neatly into a story about an inventor getting robbed. Clessie was not cheated, not pushed out, not deceived. What happened was more structural than outright theft, and in some ways more frustrating, because it was perfectly legal and because Clessie himself had agreed to every step of it. When you take someone else's money to fund your invention, you are selling ownership. Every time W.G. Irwin wrote a check to keep Cummins Engine Company alive through the 1920s and 1930s, Irwin was buying a larger share of whatever that company would eventually become. The equity math wasn't secret, it was the deal. And the deal made sense, because without Irwin's money, there would have been no company at all. Clessie's genius was real, but genius without capital dies in a garage. The deeper tension is this. Clessie Cummins was almost constitutionally unable to stop inventing and start consolidating. After Cummins Engine Company became profitable, after the IPO, even after selling his shares for $1 million, the inventing continued. He designed the compression release engine brake, a device that lets a truck driver use the engine itself to slow a heavy vehicle on a downhill grade instead of burning up the brakes. Anyone who has ever been next to an 18-wheeler on a mountain highway and heard that distinctive machine gun rattling sound as it slows down has heard what Clessie invented. He offered the design to Cummins first, but Cummins passed. So Clessie took it to Jacobs Vehicle Systems, where it became known commercially as the Jake Brake, a name derived from Jacobs, and it became standard equipment on virtually every heavy diesel truck in North America. Cummins Inc. eventually acquired Jacobs Vehicle Systems in 2022, bringing one of Clessie's inventions back to the company he founded, 73 years after he had first offered it to them. Clessie Lyle Cummins died on August 17, 1968. He had lived to see diesel engines conquer American heavy trucking, to see his fuel injection technology become the standard, to see his name on the door of a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He had made his $1 million selling stock, secured his family's future, and by most measures, his life was a success. But he had never been the majority owner of Cummins Engine Company. The Irwin family had taken the reins, and Clessie had spent the last decades of his professional life as a salaried inventor at a corporation that bore his name, ran on his ideas, and answered to someone else. Today, Cummins Inc. operates in approximately 190 countries, with annual revenue exceeding $34 billion and a workforce of more than 75,000 people. Institutional investors own the majority of the stock. The Irwin Miller family's legacy persists not primarily through equity, but through architecture, because Columbus, Indiana is filled with modernist buildings commissioned by J. Irwin Miller, a collection so notable that a New York Times architecture critic once wrote that Columbus, Indiana and J. Irwin Miller were almost holy words in architectural circles. Clessie Cummins left behind something different. He left behind the diesel engine development that changed how America moves freight. He left behind the Jake brake sitting in every truck that slows itself down a mountain grade. He left behind a direct injection fuel system that underpins a global industry to this very day. And he also left behind a question that every inventor who has ever needed outside capital will eventually have to answer for themselves. At what point does the money that saves your idea also claim it? Whether the $500 in that story was the literal seed of a $34 billion company, or whether the number has been rounded into legend the way these origin stories tend to be, almost doesn't matter. What matters is that the gap between $500 and $34 billion is a gap that Clessie Cummins crossed with his hands, and someone else captured that gap with their capital.